Thomas is like many of you know Thomas already. He doesn't need a introduction, but maybe he does need an introduction today because he shaved his beard and he's good looking, and he's going to talk about Matthew effect and cumulative status bias, which are the mechanisms to reproduce inequality. And you may be asking, okay, what is the relationship with the MBA all-star voting and our social policies? But his paper, I believe, has strong relationship with reproduction of inequalities. And he will give us the framing and why we should be interested in MBA and why we should be interested in Matthew effects in general. I just want to leave the floor to Thomas. And by the way, his co-author, Wim van Lanker, is also in the room. I hope that he might be keeping an eye on the chat. If you have any clarification questions, that he might be jumping in and then clarify those questions for Thomas. Or otherwise, I can interrupt Thomas and ask him too. But if any other substantive comments and questions, as usual, please leave them at the end. If you have any other questions that you want to talk further in person, Thomas will hang out like any other speakers that we have externally at the end of the talk for another further chat for a small group of people once we turn off the recording. So thank you so much, Thomas, and we all look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Berkay, for the introduction. Thanks, Wim, for joining us. Wim is going to be the person who you can ask all questions also later on. He will be happily reply to all your concerns and problems that you might have with this research. First of all, very thankful for the introduction. Looking around, like the presenters in all the other weeks, I feel very honored to be in such an illustrious circle. And it is also nice to see a few students in the audience. And I would hope that them seeing me do this will maybe take away a little bit of undue respect towards doing research, because I guess if you see me do this, you will think, if he can do it, it cannot really be that hard, can it? So what I will present in the next 30, 40 minutes is a study in which we look at cumulative inequality using the example of the National Basketball Association. And I'm working on that, as like I said, with Michael Biegert, who's at the University of Cologne, and Wim van Lanker from the University of Leuven, or KU Leuven. It's not exactly just the university. So before I start, maybe first a word on why is this relevant, right? Why am I presenting this in an ISPP seminar? So the topic might seem very niche, and you might have some doubt why we should care about inequality and status process among what are mostly multimillionaires, right? But I hope that I will be able to convince you that this is simply a good case study that provides us a great opportunity to analyze a very basic social process that underlies social inequality generation in many instances. So Matthew effects, we'll talk about, are considered to be one of the central mechanisms to create cumulative inequality and to increase and stabilize inequality over time. So let me start you off with an illustrative example, which is a basketball player called Kobe Bryant. Some of you might have heard of him, most recently, mostly due to sad news because he died in a helicopter crash in January this year. So what we are wondering to start us off in this paper is, why was this player elected to be an NBA All-Star in 2016? So to give you a little bit of background, the NBA All-Star game is an annual game that showcases the best player in the NBA in that season. So, and the player for this game are elected by the public, so the fans and the coaches. And coming back to Kobe Bryant, he was certainly considered to be one of the best players in his generation, but at this point in 2016, this was his last year in the league, and so he was way past his productive peak. And in fact, some comprehensive statistics showed that not only was he not among the very best players, which he should be if he goes into the All-Star game, he was actually a below average player in that year. And as sociologists, we can look now at two different arguments that support his election. And we would identify both of these arguments as kind of iterations of a Matthew effect. So some fans argued that his election was a reward for his entire career. So that's kind of an exhibits cumulative advantage over time and the Matthew effect in general. And then more specifically, others have argued that looking at his statistics, and despite these statistics being below average, they still said he was still one of the best players despite those statistics. So the second argument kind of refers to one of the underlying mechanisms of Matthew effects, which is status bias. I'll get into more detail what these terms mean in a second. So what does that mean? What is a Matthew effect? What is status bias? I'm sure all of you know your Bible, and in particular this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, which states that, well, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And maybe some of you have attended Amelia's talk a couple of weeks ago, where she also already talked about Matthew effects. So some of this might be familiar to you. So it was in reference to this quote from the Bible that Robert Merton coined the term Matthew effect. And in his highly famous study from 1968, he looked at academics and observed that those with a high status signal, the ones who got a Nobel Prize in his case, received more rewards for their contributions to work than their peers who didn't have this high status signal, although they would have put in the same effort. The explanation why this happens is usually that people use the signal of a high status as a shortcut to assess somebody's productivity or the quality of their work if they don't have more detailed information about it. Over time, receiving that credit provides further opportunities and begets further advantages. So, for instance, as an academic, you get cited more, you get more research grants, and that leads to a self-reinforcing process, which is the Matthew effect, which creates accumulation of advantage over time. And that means advantages on one side always means disadvantages on the other side, right? The ones who don't have that status signal are disadvantaged. And this leads to increasing inequality over time. So Matthew effects are often invoked as the cause of cumulative inequality. If an initial status signal leads to unequal distribution of resources, that should lead to an unequal allocation of status, that should lead to an even more unequal allocation of resources, and so on. So we end up with a feedback loop. And if that is true, what we should expect is an ever-increasing inequality between people. And relevant for us, for our particular study here, we should observe a growing entrenchment of high status positions over time. Underlying the Matthew effect, as I mentioned before, are basically two mechanisms. The first one, which some people call socially endogenous investment, states that there can be Matthew effects and cumulative inequality over time because we actually increase our productivity. So the example, if we're using Merton's research, would be that a high status academic gets better funding and they are then able to produce better research. And so they are kind of justifying why they then also remain in the high status position. The other mechanism is that there is a status bias or socially endogenous inference. So this is when the productivity of a person is assessed in a biased way because of the status signal. This is status bias. So status bias in particular in this process is then the biased evaluation of an individual's performance or productivity or a product quality, with the bias emerging because the individual sends a status signal. And when coming back to Merton, his example for people being evaluated in a status biased way is if they make equal contributions to a scientific publication as their co-authors, right? Then the ones who have the higher status signal, they are by the audience, they are deemed to have contributed more without the audience knowing actually what each person contributed. So your status signal indicates to people that you actually contributed more to research, and that is a status biased evaluation of your work. In our modern societies that revolve around claimed meritocratic ideals, status bias is of course particularly problematic because it leads to an allocation of resources and status that is not in line with productivity or effort and talent and so on. However, there are some scholars out there, especially in the economic sociology literature that studies, for instance, business relations and markets, that argue that Matthew effects don't necessarily have to be problematic, as long as the rising advantage is correlated with rising productivity. So they argue if the first mechanism, socially endogenous investment, is dominant, then it's actually not a problem necessarily, because they justify their higher status with better production over time, or higher performance, or higher quality. So that's especially true in meritocratic domains. They argue where the initial status signal is already kind of a result of better performance, right? So you're giving a status signal to somebody because they have performed better. Then they use the advantages that they get because they have the status signal to kind of improve themselves or produce at a higher quality, and so they justify that they receive those advantages and over time. And so from a societal perspective, it's not as problematic. That's a very lax understanding of meritocracy, of course, and we might question if we want to condone cumulative advantage that only correlates with actual productivity differences, but that's not necessarily something to discuss in this talk. So now, Matthew effects have been widely studied, and cumulative advantage and disadvantage and status bias have been shown to operate in many fields, disparate fields such as science, in business, in culture, or sports. And they have shown that there is that higher status signals can lead to, in the case of academics, higher citation counts, or that you get more prestigious research grants, or in the market that you fetch higher wages in the labor market, or that you get higher product prices for the goods that you produce, or that you get a preferential evaluation of your performance in sports, right? And so there's lots of studies that show status bias, the second mechanism, in evaluations of citations, grants, wages, performance evaluations. And there's also a lot of research that shows that people actually invest again in their performance, right? That they improve their performance subsequent to getting the higher status signal. So there is such a thing as socially endogenous inference as well. However, the existing research usually analyzes the effect of a status signal on some specific subsequent outcome. For instance, they show how being a high status academic affects your citation counts. But so far, the research does not really look at the full feedback loop, right? They don't look how your initial status signal kind of loops back into a repetition of that status signal, that you get the status signal again. And that is, of course, sometimes difficult to do because, well, most people don't get a second Nobel Prize, right? So you cannot really study that. And there are many areas where there is no such thing as a repeated status assignment. But there are other areas where this is quite frequent, and the case study that we're using today is one of them. Another problem that existing research has usually is that it is very hard to isolate status bias from performance differences. So firstly, it's hard to determine to what degree the initial status signal was reflective of performance differences, right? You have, how much does a Nobel Prize winner deserve the prize in comparison with those who didn't get it? And second, it's often hard to evaluate how this then affects your subsequent productivity. So if the prize winner gets cited more afterwards, maybe that's just simply because their papers are better. And so status bias is the deviation from actual productivity differences. So to determine this deviation, we have to be able to measure the quality or the productivity both before the initial status to isolate the overall Matthew effect, and then also after the initial status to disentangle the status bias from socially endogenous inference, because people might actually improve their performance. Right? And in addition, most studies cannot really look at growing divergence over time. This is usually a problem of restricted data because we don't have so many observations of people over time and repeated status allocations. But that leads to the problem that this accumulation over time, the cumulative inequality, is often just implied and not really tested. But we can, of course, very well imagine that having several status distinctions in a row will further increase the bias in the evaluation. So there might be something that we call cumulative status bias. right? So this is what we are adding to the existing research, is that we want to have an explicit test in how far a status signal leads not only to a biased evaluation of a performance and then some distribution of goods, but eventually leads to a confirmation of that status and thus leads to status persistence over time. We also want to disentangle status bias from the actual changes in performance and the situation that people are in. And finally, we want to check if the process is actually cumulative. Is there actually ever increasing inequality over time? And we do so in a setting, the annual NBA All-Star elections, that is nominally a meritocratic domain, right? The NBA All-Star elections are about performances and deserving to be elected. So it's a meritocratic domain. The idea is that the people vote for the best players. And because voters should have actually a fairly easy access to objective information, to statistics, we argue that our test is a conservative test for Matthew effects and status bias in particular, right? Because as I argued earlier, where status bias and Matthew effects thrive is if there's greater uncertainty. But this should be a context where uncertainty is not that large, because you can actually look up how well a player performs. So our research questions are then whether being elected an NBA All-Star in 1 year leads to being elected an NBA All-Star in the next year, with being an NBA All-Star being the clear status signal of elevated status. And then we want to exactly know what role does status bias play in this process. And then we want to know, is the process really cumulative? Meaning, is there increasing inequality in the chance of becoming an All-Star? So let's get into it. Like I said, the NBA All-Star game is an exhibition game played every year about mid-season. The 5 starting players for both the Eastern and the Western Conference respectively are voted for by the public, so the fans. And then the coaches of the league select the 7 reserve players. And you can say that becoming an All-Star is really an important status signal that is reserved for the best players. And it comes up in arguments about players' quality in the media and so on. It comes into play when there's a discussion about whether players can enter the Hall of Fame. And sometimes there are actually contractual regulations that All-Star nominations will actually feed into your salaries eventually. So there are great advantages that come with this status signal. And when we now look at this process, this offers us a great opportunity to analyze the role of Matthew effects and status persistence, because in difference to many other settings, the status has to be actively confirmed every year. There's an election every year, right? This is also an example of a status hierarchy in which there's a clear expectation that the status is assigned meritocratically, and that the information on performance would be available to the voters. So to test our hypotheses, we use data on NBA players from 1984 to 2016. And we don't use earlier years because some information on performance is only available from 1984. And so our data set contains 1,890 players that have come into the league since 1984. And our data set spans a total of about more than 10,000 player years. So that means the players are on average in the league for 5.5 years. Most importantly, we have data on who was among those 24 players elected to the All-Star game every year. In total, all these All-Star elections fall onto 172 players who share a total of 626 nominations. We get all our data from a website called Basketball Reference. Here on the left-hand side, you can see an example how this might look. Right? So there are separate sites for each player and each of their seasons. Right? And you can imagine that amounts to quite a lot of different websites. So we had somebody help us write some web scraping algorithm to get all this data. And so now that we have all this data, we have information on such factors as players' race, their height, their position they play, their age, and so on. And then, and here's another, this is the big reason why this case study is a great opportunity to analyze status effects, is that we have in sports the opportunity to really measure productivity or performance quite accurately. If you compare this to other fields like labor market studies, where it is quite hard to actually make arguments about how productive a person is. In sports, that's quite easy to quantify, and especially American sports have been collecting statistics diligently over the last decades. So the performance of a basketball player can be captured in how many points, rebounds, and assists they collect on average. There are other indicators which we also have. Can talk about that later. And then there's also, because it's a team sport, we also want to adjust for some team level differences and other situational factors. For instance, how we measure how good the team is by the team's win percentage. So how many wins a team gets out of how many games. How many minutes a player can play actually is of course an important factor. Whether the team made it to the playoffs, and then we also adjust for this is a big issue in the US, whether you are in a big market, in a big media market town, right, like Los Angeles or New York or so. That's usually seen as an advantage in these types of contexts. And so we have all this data for basically more than 1 million game logs for all players. And so what we do with that is we construct averages that lead up for the time that leads up in a season to the All-Star game. So the data on which basically the idea would be that whether you get to be an All-Star or not is decided. So we have to have all those game logs because the All-Star game is played in the middle of the year. We cannot just use season averages. And then to also measure what people are doing between All-Star games, we then also construct the averages for the entire period between two All-Star games, right? And I'll tell you now what we are doing with this data and how we use it. So, start very simple. So based on our theoretical arguments about mass effects, our central expectation is that being elected an All-Star in 1 year will increase the chance to be re-elected in the following year. Because there is a binary outcome, we used logistic regressions, and then we'll calculate average marginal effects. This for now is of course the unadjusted association only between having been an All-Star at T-1 and becoming an All-Star at T. Obviously, that does not help us with estimating a causal effect yet. So what we first want to adjust for are confounding characteristics of players that might drive the election results at all times, right? So constant confounders, like the age when you were entering the league, the time that you've spent since in the league, how tall you are, the position that you play, your race, important factor, right? So we need to adjust for those. Importantly still now, we have to adjust for your performance at the situation that you've been in prior to the treatment. Because of course, those players who are on better teams and the players who are playing more and those who are simply better, they will be more likely to become All-Star first and then again a year later. So this is obviously predicting getting the treatment, and we would expect that better players have a higher likelihood, and that of course we have to isolate that. So again, it's very nice for us that we have a pretty precise measure of performance pre-treatment. And so if we adjust for this battery of variables, then we think that we estimate the full Matthew effect, the full advantage that you get from having been an All-Star at T-1 on your chances to be re-elected. And then, now it gets more tricky. We want to estimate how much of this Matthew effect is actually driven by a status-biased evaluation from voters and coaches. So for this now, we include players' post-treatment performance, because a player who is elected All-Star might actually get better afterwards because, like some psychological boost, or, they might feel validated and put more time in. Or you could also argue that they actually do worse, but then we still need to adjust for that. And then we also want to adjust for changes in the situation of a player post-treatment. So the argument would be that an all-star might get better opportunities because they can go to a better team, or their team gets better, or because coaches increase their minutes on the court, and this will also help them get reelected, and is not status bias of the voters, right? If anything, their improved situation would reflect status bias by team owners, for instance, if they buy them, but we still want to isolate that out. So when we adjust for these variables, what should be left is status bias. So that is the fans evaluate the performance of a player better because he has the signal of having been an all-star in the previous year. Finally, final models.
Sorry, Thomas, can I just use my privileges and ask a clarification question?
Please.
So I missed out the rationale for why you want to adjust all of those post-treatment characteristics, and what is the meaning of the net Matthew effect free from those characteristics? Maybe they are part of the Matthew.
The Matthew effect can go through basically two mechanisms. Either because people eventually will have a status biased assessment of their quality, right? And so that's what we want to isolate, because that's what we think is the most problematic part, the status bias. Or the Matthew effect can partly be translated also because it actually improves you, right? And that we want to disentangle those two, and so that's why we adjust for all this post-treatment performance, right? Because you might actually have a psychological boost, for instance, you get greater confidence, or you go into a different team, and we want to isolate those away because this is the Matthew effect. This is going to lead to cumulative advantage, but some would argue, well, but you're getting better, so it's justified that you get re-elected, right? So that's the idea. Happy to discuss that more. So finally, we want to estimate the cumulative effect, right? So for this, what we are doing we are including the number of all-star elections that you've already accumulated before the treatment. And we also include the average of all the mediators, right, for all the performance and situation variables up to the treatment in order to estimate what we call cumulative status bias. So if we're doing that, this will allow us to estimate whether a previous all-star election before the treatment have a direct effect on the outcome in excess of their effect on the all-star election as the treatment, right? Because if there's no additional effect of having been an all-star before the treatment, that is, all of the status bias and the Matthew effect flows through the treatment, then there is no growing inequality, then there's just a level difference that is kind of induced at every year. And as soon as you're not getting elected, then you're losing the whole status signal. In a final model, we interact the treatment at T-1 with the previous all-starships because we are interested in whether the effect varies of the cumulative assignments, if the effect varies by if you're getting elected in the treatment year or not. So here's a place as good as any to note that, of course, now we are assuming that there are no unmeasured confounders, right? So we have great data on productivity and performance and all that. It's very detailed, but of course you can come and make cases that there is maybe something missing. One thing that we've been thinking about is it's maybe some players have higher charisma and that's why they get elected, and that's something we are not observing. And that could be part of the story. One way we try to find out if that's really a big issue is that we tried to predict, just with our performance indicators, the probability to be elected for the very first time. And we have a fairly high R-square. We can explain a first election of about 60%. So that makes us a little more confident that there is no unmeasured factors, but of course, there is still a chance. And I'm happy to talk about this and other potential problems later on. So that's what we'll do. So let's now see what we find. First, let me show you just some distribution of all-star nominations across those players who ever got nominated, because I don't want to show you the ones who never got nominated, because out of the 1890, 720 players never got nominated. This is how nominations got distributed across the players that ever were nominated. So you can see that the largest amount is players who were only elected once, but there's actually a good chunk of players who were elected more often. About 2/3 of the players who ever were elected more than once. So already hints at some kind of accumulation. Whether you get elected or not surprisingly, is highly correlated with actual performance indicators. I show you here a bivariate correlation with points scored, so probably the most important performance indicator. And you can see that the more points you scored, I don't want to get into detail what this measure actually, what the scale of the measure is. But the more points you score, the more all-star nominations you have. But you can also see that there's this amassment of all-star nominations that is above the regression line. So there's a group of players who kind of gets a lot of points that is not just clearly predicted by points. And this looks similar for rebounds and assists. Now on the next slide, you can see basically all of the major results of our regression model. So these are now all the models that I introduced on the slides before with the graphs and the regression formulas. So let's start at the very top. What we see from model 1 is the unadjusted association between having been an all-star last year and becoming it again. And you can see that if you have been an all-star last year, your likelihood to become it again is almost 60%. And then in the next model, we adjust for baseline confounders, which reduces the association already quite a bit to 46% if we're adjusting for race, height, and so on. And now it gets more interesting. Model 3 is our estimate of the Matthew effect, right? And you can see that now the effect, if we're adjusting for differences in performance and situation pre-treatment, then we get to a coefficient of 4.7 percentage points difference, right? So having been an all-star, net of all your performance and situation indicators yields a Matthew effect of 4.7 percentage points that it increases your chance to be re-elected. In models 4 and 5, we are now introducing the post-treatment factors to isolate the status bias, which reduces. So we want to know how much of those 4.7% percentage points are due to status bias, and we end up with 2.4 percentage points are due to status bias.
Thomas, sorry, Diwakar had posted a question on chat about your measure on being better team player. So do you have a variable that measures someone is a better team player? Like that's a few slides past, but I was.
Yeah, no, we don't. There is no such measure. You can, I mean, what does that mean? Maybe. That would be difficult to measure, I think. You could, I mean, on the one hand, you could argue that it's something like assists or so on, but that's not really what I think is a good team player means. A good team player would maybe mean that I actually am happy to yield some of my stats in order for the team to get better. Then that should maybe be reflected in the team win percentage. But there is no measure of being a good team player. I'm sorry about that, or sorry for us, I guess, if it's a problem. Okay, and then in the final two models, we want to estimate the cumulative status bias, right? So, and that's kind of what's important now are the two estimates at the bottom, right? And we can see that every additional nomination that you received prior to the treatment gives you another 0.4 percentage points increase in the likelihood to be re-elected. And I said earlier that we want to see if that actually differs between whether you've been elected in the last year or not. So here you can see that if you've been elected last year, then an additional year before gives you 0.4 percentage points. If you have not been elected before, then I'm sorry, if you've not been elected in the previous years, then having been elected before gives you an additional 0.5 percentage points per election. So what does that mean? Isn't that all quite small, maybe you wonder? Now, like we're making a big point about status bias, and now we're talking about 0.4, 0.5 percentage points. So the first thing is, maybe let's contextualize. So there's 24 All-Star nominations per year, and there are around 450 players in the league at any time in the year, right? So the unconditional probability to become an All-Star is below 5%. And in that context, raising your chances by, let's say, 2.4 percentage points because of status bias is quite a bit, actually. Right? You're raising your chances by 50%. And add 3 or 4 previous nominations, and you're raising it by another 1.2 or 1.6 percentage points. So that can make actually quite a difference. And the point is also that this is, of course, true for the whole distribution. So this is kind of the average effect for everybody, even the worst player, for whom it actually, you now might wonder, does it even make sense to think about status bias for them if they never would have the chance? This is not really a great counterfactual, because they would never get this treatment. So one way how we thought about we could address that is, what we did is we compared our main results with a subsample of players who were ever relatively close, at least, to getting elected. So we have data on whoever got into the top 20 in the elections for their different positions. And so we use a subsample of those people who ever were top ranked. And so the full lines in this figure are the ones just from the previous one, So this is the full sample. And we can see that if we look at this reduced sample, that actually the effect is quite a bit larger. So there we have a Matthew effect of 12.5 percentage points, status bias of 6.7, and then added for every additional year of 1.3 percentage points. So that makes quite a difference too. Another way to contextualize before I sum up the size of these effects is if you compare it to what would it mean in terms of performance. And so I don't want to overinterpret coefficients for our performance indicators because we're not estimating causal effects. But just to give you some context, in the model 3, where we estimate the Matthew effect, the estimate for every point that you score per 36 minutes in addition is about 0.4 percentage points. So that means that kind of on a scale, it would mean that you would have to score about 10 points more per 36 minutes played in order to even out the advantage that somebody else has who has the status signal of having been previously elected. So, to sum up, sending the status signal of having been elected to the All-Star game increases your likelihood by, well, varies, but by, let's say, in the overall sample by 4.7 percentage points to be re-elected in the next year. And this can be partly explained by that players are actually becoming better or they get into better situations after the election. But there remains an effect after adjusting for performance, which indicates that there is status bias of 2.4 percentage points. And furthermore, prior All-Star elections further increase the chance. So we have some evidence for cumulative status bias. So there's entrenchment of status positions over time. Implications, that means that the Matthew effect increases status persistence because what we look at as an outcome is the re-election and thus the active confirmation of the status signal. We can conclude that status bias eventually also leads status hierarchies to be upheld, leading to status persistence and increasingly rigid social structures, right? Status bias and cumulative status bias leading to that. And now, as an implication now to, like this literature that argues that, well, cumulative advantage can be unproblematic for meritocratic standards. If the status allocation is itself status biased, we would argue that it is very hard to reconcile that with even a very lax understanding of meritocratic ideals. And because we're looking at this in a very conservative setting, we would say like we can generalize from, or not generalize, but we would argue that, well, if cumulative status bias can make it here in this conservative setting, then it can make it anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That's a super interesting presentation. I will just, a lot of applauses all from the audience.
Sure.
I see some hands over there. I see a hand from Johan very far away in a very small point, but I think that's Johan is waving a hand to ask a question, hopefully. So I'm going to collect the questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hands up.
Thomas, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thomas, so two things. First, I just want to extend a compliment. This was just a lot of fun to listen to, which is, and so thank you. I just really enjoyed it. That's the first thing. The second thing, can you go to the image of your model, please?
Which one?
The full, oh yeah, great. That one's great. So I want to ask you about the performance bubble immediately, immediately after, between t-1 and t. I guess the point I'm about to ask could just as easily apply to the previous performance bubble, but I'm wondering, after someone has been elected to an all-star game, I'm wondering about the neatness of the performance indices that you're using to measure how well someone does, because my sense is that upon having been elected an all-star, the way people are going to play isn't the only thing that then varies. One could very much imagine that the other players on the court treat that player differently on the court. And I was wondering whether or not one, whether you think that's plausible, and two, what does that do?
So I guess that's plausible, similar as it is plausible to assume that maybe how your situation improves after you've been elected an all-star, you get more minutes allotted to play, for instance. I think both these cases might be, in a sense, status bias by the players that are around you or by the coaches that are there, right? But it is not the kind of status bias that is that we want to isolate, because it would still mean that you're performing better, you deliver more, you play more minutes, right? And so you're kind of still justifying with your performance to get reelected. So I think it's very realistic to assume that it. So I mean, we have run models in which we predict post-treatment performance and situation, and we can see that the status bias, the status signal of getting elected, the treatment actually improves basically all indicators afterwards, right? So players get better, they get into better situations on average, and so on. So that happens. And if that happens because you actually get greater confidence and get more productive, or it is because your co-players are kind of referring to you more, with more with more reference to you, and they give you the ball all the time, that we cannot really distinguish. But I would also argue that, at least if we are interested in the question whether you can justify that you get reelected by increasing your productivity, then I don't think it's necessarily a concern. Not sure if you agree.
Yeah, I don't. Because your point is about a change in one's co-players' behavior, and yeah. I'm wondering about whether opponents play very differently, because they're giving, there are two different directions this could go, right? There's the Steph Curry direction, where after Steph Curry's elected an all-star, people start playing very aggressively towards him, and that distorts his performance. There's also the Kevin Durant story, where upon him being elected all-star, people give him a very wide berth. It just seems like the performance indicators are muddier than I think your answer a moment ago would would indicate.
But it's, I mean, it depends on what you, I guess it depends very much on what you would argue will justify getting elected. Is it, you know, like putting together a performance under maybe increasingly hard or easy conditions, or is it just about the performance that you put together? Right. So the question is, should we want the voters to respect that somebody might have been kind of played harder than others? Or should we basically want voters to just reflect how well they performed? But I mean, it's a good point that I haven't thought about before.
So Evan, your hand is up. I think you're going to ask a question. Can you?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. This has been really interesting. My question was about the voting. I know you mentioned this earlier in the background, but I know that it's both the fans voting as well as the coaches voting for the reserves. Yeah. So is both of this considered in the model, and is it weighed equally or is it weighed differently?
No, so in the main models we have all of it in there. And actually, thanks for the opportunity. So I can show you something from our backup. So because we actually thought this might be an interesting thing to make use of, because of course you could argue that the, you know, like status bias and Matthew effects will look very different in those two voting bodies, right? You would argue, and that's what we also did. We thought we are interested in whether greater uncertainty leads to greater status bias or not, and we argued that well, even though there is wide access to statistics, the coaches will still be much better informed than the voting public. So we would expect that they show a smaller status bias, and so we ran models in which we distinguished between the two. So here are the results of that, and I'll give you some explanation. So basically, the full lines are the coaches, and the dashed lines are the players. Why the dashed lines are on the negative side is because we had to run this as a Heckman selection model, because the coach's decision is only coming in after the public's decision, so they can only vote for people that are still in the sample, right? So players have been selected already, and so in those models we then have to predict not getting elected by the public, and then depending on that we have to predict if somebody got elected by the coaches. So you can basically just mirror the coefficients for the public to the other side, and what we were surprised to see is basically that if anything, then the coaches show a bigger bias than the public. All right, if your Matthew effect is 5.8 compared to 2.4. These differences are probably not as meaningful, though, as it might look. They are probably overlapping confidence intervals. And also there is an explanation for this. In some of the literature, they talk about third order inference, which is basically that some people, even though they have better information, make these decisions in order to please somebody else. Right, because they're kind of considering what would the wider population want, for instance. And so in this case, the argument could go that the coaches, they know what the people want, and so they are kind of using the style, and they saw who did well in the election by the public, but just did not get in, and so they're just taking those players and thus do not reduce their status bias. But yeah, I mean, so in the main models. We are pooling everything. We've also run models that just look at who got elected by the public, and if that kind of affects it differently. But there we didn't find any differences. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Johan. I don't see any hands so far. Do people have any questions? If not, I might ask a question.
Evelina had her hand up.
Evelina, sorry. I'm looking at blue hands on the side, so go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, and thank you for the presentation. I have, may I ask 2 quick questions, or shall I keep it to 1?
No, I mean, since there's nobody else in the line except for Berkay, please ask away.
One is follow-up to the fact that bias might be bigger for coaches. It's obviously a different sample because the biggest stars might have already been chosen by the public, but I was wondering how the choices of coaches fit into who plays in the season in the first place, like the minutes players would play in the first place. So you mentioned media exposure, for example, but then coaches choices can make players visible, some players more visible compared to others, regardless of media exposures, in terms of just not playing as reserves but playing full games, etc. Yeah. And then the other one was, I was wondering whether so there were these few players, you show these outliers like the average line, and like outliers like Jordan, O'Neal, Bryant, etc. I was wondering whether you estimated how many times some of these players were elected, and then what the whole cumulative effect would be over their playing career, say if they were elected for 15 years compared to somebody else who only made it for 2 years because all the places were already taken by all-star players or like by the big names. Then the cumulative effect over 15 years might be, I don't know how long they play, might be much bigger compared to like 3 years or something.
Yeah. So thank you very much. First question, yes. That is, so you could argue that basically some of the performance indicators or situation indicators that we are measuring post-treatment are already affected by some form of status bias, because coaches might, because they see somebody has been an all-star, they might let them play more. They maybe increase the number of minutes they're playing. And so you could make a point, if you wanted to, that if we're interested in the like everything that is just due to status bias, that then we are kind of, we have over control bias. We are controlling away the causal effect. We think that at this point, we are only interested in the status bias in the election. And so, so we would argue that if you're actually then playing more minutes, because the coaches let you play more, maybe because of status bias, you're still, by doing that and then still keeping up your performance indicators, you're kind of still justifying getting elected. So we don't find it too problematic. That's maybe as fishy as the answer that I gave to Jon earlier. The second thing, so that's exactly, I'm sorry if that was confusing. But that's exactly what we're estimating here. Those small effects down there are the cumulative effects, right? So you get a treatment effect in those last models. You get a treatment effect of, let's say, 2.1 of the just previous All-Star election from last year. But then for every election that you had prior to that, you get another 0.4 percentage points. So in our case now here, Kobe Bryant, he was an All-Star 18 times. So in the last election, 2016, that comes back to our original question. Thanks for the opportunity. We would say he got a status biased advantage from the last year's election, from the 2017 one, because he was elected then, of 2.1, and then he gets 16 times 0.4, can't do that in my head, 4.8 percentage points in addition to that. 4.8, what am I saying? Sorry about that. That must be 16 times 4. Come on, guys. 64. God damn it. Thanks, Lucinda. So 6.4 additional percentage points. So the cumulative status bias for him in total would have been then 6.4 plus 2.1, so around 8.5 percentage points. So that would be exactly, that is one of the crucial arguments. Thanks for raising it. So I guess I have to make that clearer, is that it's not only just the one that happened last year, but if you have had more elections, then you have additional advantages. Does it clarify?
Yeah, I think it's also thinking in terms of mortgage payments and interest rates, for example, like the longer you, like the opposite sign in this case, obviously, but the longer you stay, the bigger your advantage would be, because it kind of compounds.
Yeah, and of course, we could wonder if there's maybe some, you know, if the functional form is really accurate, or if we would have to complicate that, but it's complicated enough as it is. Berkay, do you want to throw something out?
I have a question, but I haven't seen Gudong's question that is posted on the chat before. So he says basically, as the confounder system is complex, I wonder if a DID, difference in differences design, is a better choice to identify the causal relationship.
So we've been thinking about other designs as well. The problem is that with other designs such as a DID or if we just did matching or something like that, right? The problem is that it would be more intuitive to model the treatment, the immediate treatment effect, but it would, I don't know how we could do the cumulative thing where we look at people over time and then have an accumulation of status signals, and because there is then every time there is post-treatment things in between, right? So we could not really estimate then how having been elected several times before eventually affects your outcome, right? Because it's just not such a neat 2 time points estimate. So, I mean, if you have an idea how we could do a DID, I'd be happy to hear it. The other problem that we have, and this is, for instance, a reason why we're not running fixed effects models, is that if we are running fixed effects models, everybody who never gets elected is thrown out of the data, and then we're ending up with a sample of 172 people, and we're basically only estimating, because our outcome is also getting elected, we are only estimating basically how getting elected a second time affects your the outcome, and that's not what we want. Does that help? Or, I mean, I'm happy to hear propositions of how to do this differently, because of course the unobserved heterogeneity issue is maybe relevant.
Gudong, is that okay as an answer? What do you want to just say?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, don't give me an answer. I just I know the idea couldn't identify the accumulation effect. I just wonder, it may become a support for your causal identification, because it can also give more evidence to this causal relationship do exist.
Yeah, some people in the department who are in the quantitative reading group might remember that we some years ago still actually had this as a regression discontinuity design, which we've given up on, also because of, among other things, that this accumulation is not, we cannot estimate that with that, and with other problems that I don't want to go into. So yeah, I mean, I guess for the direct effect, for the immediate effect, it would maybe make sense to run some other models as well. Yeah. Good point.
Okay, so so Lucinda's hand is up. I can keep my question to the end. Okay, Lucinda, do you want to go ahead?
It was really interesting, thank you. I was just wondering, I mean, I think it's still status bias in your terms, but I was wondering whether when people are voting this, they may ostensibly be voting for the best players, but aren't they also voting for the players they actually want to see play? And I mean, that's probably the same thing as status bias, but you can think of examples where you're not necessarily assuming they're the best player, but oh, I would just love to see them play even though they're past their best, because I would never have, or because it's really exciting, or
Yes, that's a good point. I mean, I think on the one hand, that kind of comes into this issue of unobserved heterogeneity, that some people might be more charismatic or so. But even besides that, of course, there might be the issue that people are not taking what the election is supposed to be about, which is we want to see the best players, right? That's what it originally kind of nominally is about, that we are rewarding those who have played at the highest level, that people are not taking that seriously, and that they are coming in with other criteria, like, for instance, who's fun to look at. Or, big example was always Chinese player Yao Ming, who got elected pretty much every year simply because, China is a big country. There's a lot of people in China who might vote, and they don't have many other players from China that they might vote for. So they often, he often got elected simply because of his origin. But we hope that this only, at least that case is, is an outlier. That doesn't, because most other players are from the US and are elected by Americans, and so it doesn't happen often. So we hope that it doesn't drive our results. But of course it could, your point more generally could of course be an issue, and I'm not sure if we would want to subsume that under status bias. The problem is more like, is our assumption that the voters honor the idea of the election, that if that is too strong of an assumption, maybe. Could go into political elections as well, right? Do we want to vote for the person who we think will be the best leader of the country, or do we want somebody who's kind of funny? Yeah, Becca.
Sorry, Thomas. There are two more hands up I want to get through, and I want to be able to ask my question as well. So, so the first hand is from Michaela. And Michaela, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Something completely out of what I usually hear about. So even more interesting for that reason. I just have a question. Maybe it's following up a bit on what Lucinda said, what you just explained. I was thinking about some measure of popularity outside of the game, like how often people are in media or so. Did you consider measuring for something like this, like how famous the name itself is, that people, when they vote, they just like go for familiar name rather than somebody they know from the game because they are influencers or like on Instagram or things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's, of course, that goes in the direction of what Lucinda said, that there might be something else, just popularity. Or, we don't have a measure for that, and looking to the media might be an option, but I think for us that would be too much of an effort to add that, to kind of add a whole kind of because I think just going to one newspaper or so wouldn't be enough, because you kind of would have to cover both sides of the country and all that. So we would have to. That would be a lot of effort, I think. Additionally, of course, there's the question in how much your popularity is also endogenous to getting elected. So it can be both, could be both way around, right? Either you first become an all-star. So our general argument is that we can predict with performance alone, that we can predict our first all-starship quite well. And so we hope that there's not too many other factors in there, and everything that happens afterwards is already endogenous then to your first election. But yeah, it's clearly that might be an issue.
So Evan has another question, I think, and meanwhile, Evelina asked about whether this could be taste-based discrimination, and on the chat, Gudon agreed, but I'm assuming that Gudon is agreeing with Evelina's question. So if you want to take Evan's question and then answer them both at the same time, that will be great.
Yeah, so my question is about time, because I know that the NBA today is very different from like the NBA in the 1980s. We got, social media, and it's just fans have a very different relationship with the game than they did back then. And then also geography, in terms of like what city they're in. I remember I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, so when I was a kid, I used to actually vote on the games. I remember I used to always vote for the players first that were like on my hometown team. Does your model like capture those time variant or geography variant characteristics?
So first on geography, we don't have. We first thought we might want to have just team dummies in those models, but that didn't work because there are some teams who never basically get an all-star in, so they would perfectly predict the outcome. So what we did is basically what we have now is a dummy for whether you're in a big market town or not. That's the only way how we're including geography, but maybe there would be more fine-grained measures of, let's say, I don't know, size of the town or so in there. The thing is, we cannot connect the fans to. I mean, we don't know where the fans are, right? Who votes? So we wouldn't know that if you gave your vote for a player from Cleveland, we wouldn't know that this vote came also from somebody who was in Cleveland, right? I mean, but the general argument would be that then people from bigger areas where there's more people who could vote for them would have a benefit, right? And we hope that we kind of get that with this big market, big media market measure, but it might be a bit too blunt for it. And then you're spot on again about the time changes over time. So we have another thing that we did is basically, this is also very blunt, but we compared if there are differences between eras, and here we're just comparing basically pre-internet age, let's say, and then internet age. So dividing at 1999, where there was actually no all-star game. So, and you can see we would also, like similarly wanted to find out how uncertainty might play a role. And the argument would be that nowadays people can be much better informed about statistics and so on than back in the day. And you can see that the coefficients are slightly smaller in the more recent times, but not in a very meaningful way. So maybe we would have to do that in a more fine-grained way. But the problem is, as you can see already from those confidence intervals, that then the samples get pretty small. We cannot do too much with that. But yeah, I mean, that is something that we thought about as well. What you mentioned, that maybe that there's change over time, and maybe there's some indication that there is to some degree. And then there was another question by Evelina, right? So taste-based discrimination. I mean, it's basically status-based discrimination, no? It's a status signal, and based on that, we're discriminating, even though people have the same level of productivity. It's by the way, a pleasure to get to that here, because I mean, that was something that we talked about when we talked about what do these effects actually mean, because, like the sizes, and then we came back to this literature about status-based discrimination, where they're looking into motherhood penalties and so on, right? That you have the status as a mother and you get lower wages, or you don't get invited to a job, and then how large are the sizes for those effects? They're slightly larger, but also not huge. They're usually like 7 percentage points or so. The difference in getting invited to an interview, for instance, between a mother and a non-mother. And our argument would be that the problem of that literature is that it eventually just assumes that mothers and non-mothers have the same productivity, but it can never really measure it. Right? We can never, I mean, we don't know, is it status-based discrimination or is it statistical discrimination, because we don't have a measure basically of whether the two groups are actually to a different degree productive. So that's the advantage that we hope we have if we're measuring productivity or performance well, that we can distinguish and we find, well, I guess you couldn't call it status-based discrimination, yes.
So thank you so much, Thomas. I think it's 15 past and I'm gonna stop recording, and I'll follow up with you with my own question after the recording. And if anyone wants to stay here, and like, they're welcome to stay, but I don't want to keep people in the room if they don't want to stay. So thank you so much for the great talk.
Thanks, everybody.